Hi all, my name's Steven Tyler, Steven Mancini. I've been cutting stones for a little while. I've been doing it since kind of COVID. There's really much else to do during that time, so why not learn a new skill? And since then, we've been doing a couple different things. So I'll just start a bit about me. I live in Salem, Massachusetts, which is definitely a city full of witches. And then I've been making jewelry since 2013. I started with wire wrapping, which progressed into learning finer skills of jewelry. And then in probably like 2018, I started taking like GRS classes and new approach classes and how to have a better presentation for the jewelry that I'm trying to make, how to do more professional stone setting. And then since COVID, around 2020, I learned gem cutting from Nolan Sponsler, who's a good friend of mine. He was very fortunate to have me out to his house, taught me some of the skills, and then I went home and bought all the equipment and quickly became obsessed with all of the different ways to cut gemstones. Whether it's traditional cutting or fantasy cutting or carving, whatever it may be, there's always so many more skills to learn, and it's really fun to just play around and see what comes out of the skill sets that you want to draw yourself towards. And recently in this, around July, we started building a new store in Marblehead, Mass. And we just opened in October. So if you're ever in Massachusetts, please hit me up and come by. And I do some gem cutting stuff, and we can always do classes there. So my presentation today, as you saw in the first, is how to make mistakes. Because how many people have made mistakes while they're cutting or making jewelry, broken a stone, or some mishap happens that you weren't quite prepared for, and how do you fix that? We all have those moments, so I'm hoping to, during this presentation, to show you how to make mistakes. I actually have a stone that I kind of pre-cut here prior to showing up, and I'm going to mess it up for you guys and then see how we fix it. So what are some mistakes that can happen while you're cutting? There's probably far more than on this list, but there's a couple here that has happened to all of us while we're cutting gemstones. So if you're familiar with indexing your stone, if you misindex and you have a pattern that you're trying to follow and you're one shot over, say you're trying to cut at your 0 and you go to the 1 on accident and you're leaving a flat spot where you don't want there to be one, that's really one of the first things that people will come across, because it's very easy to mix that up while you're cutting gemstones and you're in your whatever flow state that you are when you're cutting. In a similar way, you can also have an incorrect angle. If I wanted to cut at 60, but then I come in accidentally at 55 or 50, what do I do to fix that mistake? Those are a couple things we'll run over today. There's a lot of times too where you're cutting a gemstone and maybe you'll hit a fracture that you didn't quite realize was there while you're cutting. How do I fix those things, and what happens when you run into that fracture line? Is that something that you can avoid? Are there ways to fix that? Do you cut out the stone? Do you cut out the fracture? Do you leave it? That's another one as well. Missing your meet points, that's something we all do as we're cutting. Maybe your meet points don't quite align, they're a little bit like this. In the early stages, it doesn't matter as much, but in the later stages, that could be something that you want to attend to because you want to have a precision cut gemstone, right? One thing that happens to a lot of people, especially beginning cutters, is your stone may pop off the dop, depending if you're using wax, glue, or a mixture of the two. Sometimes when you apply too much pressure in a way that isn't quite right for the stone, or maybe the wax didn't adhere, you didn't leave it long enough for the wax to adhere, maybe that will pop off the dop, and you have to find a way to save the stone that you're cutting and fix it. Another one that kind of comes across too is what happens when you get a scratch in your polishing stage that's really deep. How do we fix those things? So that's a couple of the things I'm going to run over today on the flat lap. And when I get over to the lap, you're more than welcome to all come over and gather around and see what I'm doing. Also, throughout this presentation, please feel free to ask questions throughout. I'll have questions at the end as well, but if you have anything that pops into your mind, I'm happy to answer it on the go.
Excuse me, do you have your microphone on?
I can turn it up more.
Yeah, if you want to turn it up.
To compensate for the-
Yeah, yep.
Thank you.
Testing? Oh, there we go.
Good.
All right, so let's get started. So the first one that I came across was misindexing or cutting a stone at an incorrect angle, right? There's a couple things that we'll do. I'm going to kind of run over the presentation, then we'll go over onto the lap, and I'll present these things. So what happens when you misindex? It's kind of your time to make a decision about what just happened. say that I'm cutting a stone and I'm planning to cut it at a 60 degree, and then maybe I have, I'm at my 96 degree index or my 96 index. And then I mess up. Maybe I'm not paying attention. I get up from my bench and I come back. Because sometimes when you look at the stone, you have to turn the index wheel, and then I pop the index wheel back at the wrong one, and I just don't think and I start cutting, right? So as you see in the example I have here, that little yellow spot down here, that's a misindex. What happens when I mess up the cut? Do I try to cut that out and lose more weight in the stone? Or do I try to incorporate it? Because incorporating it, you're going to change your design a little bit, but that might be beneficial to whatever you're trying to cut. One thing I like to say to people, if you mess up something, mess up symmetrically, and nobody's going to know the difference. The only thing that kind of comes down to, though, is if you're doing a predestined design that you're not designing yourself, that could come into you only have certain skills to be able to finish the design pattern that you already have in front of you. If you're able to then use GemCut Studio in some way to change your design, that's going to be an added benefit overall. So yeah, that's one thing I'm going to run over here, and the design that I have in the presentation, that's the same gemstone that I'm going to be cutting. So if I hit a fracture, I may have to adjust or change the design around the inclusion. This is another thing I'll run over in GemCut Studio as well. So if I have the room to be able to cut more into the stone without losing too much weight, I'll likely do that and just have to adjust my angle slightly. You can adjust your angles down, and you can do this all within the GemCut Studio program to change the final look of the design only slightly to be able to save as much weight for the stone that you're cutting while also maximizing the brilliance of the stone. You can always just readjust your angles as well. If I miss my meet point or I overcut a little bit, in the early grits, that's not a big deal. We're really just getting the faces in to the gemstone, and your meet points may not meet up exactly right. But when I'm in the polishing stages and the final later grits, oh, thank you. No, when I'm in the polishing stages and the later grits, there's going to be some changes that you might have to make if you overcut a little bit. I don't necessarily recommend using the cheater if you're starting out gem cutting, because that can get a little bit confusing, and I'll go over what the cheater means on the mast. But usually you just have to go slightly deeper. Sometimes you can, if your meet points are almost exact and you just need to nudge it a little bit, you can do that in the pre-polishing stage or the polishing stage, depending on the laps that you're using. I recommend like the BAT laps or the BA5T laps. Those are a little harder, and I've been able to meet my meet points with those while just nudging them down, nudging the facets down very slightly. What happens if your stone pops off the dop, which I'll also demonstrate for you guys? Well, I'll try to. So if my stone pops off the dop, sometimes it'll be a little, I use wax and glue for this. If my stone pops off, sometimes there's a little bit of wax left on the stone or glue, and same with on the dop. And I try to puzzle piece them back together with glue to then see if I can retain the same width-length ratio of the gemstone that I'm cutting. And again, I'll demonstrate that as well. And depending on how, how the stone pops off, how you were able to puzzle piece it back together, you may have to cut down the stone a little bit more than what you wanted originally, but at least you can still finish the gemstone. Sometimes there's a scratch during polishing stage. If there is a scratch while you're at your 60K or your 100K finish, check the lap for gouges. You can also clean your lap with acetone and reapply the correct diamond grit. Sometimes you can attempt to get the scratch out with the polished lap, like I mentioned, but you'll likely have to go back to pre-polish depending on how deep the scratch is. I know I've come across a couple times where, say I'm working on a bat lap that I had a student use and they maybe applied the wrong diamond grit onto the lap. You have to clean that lap fully so that you don't, you don't have 3K on your 60K lap, because you never get the final polish that you want. Then it happens, you know what I mean? Sometimes there's a lot of times where you'll be cutting maybe 8 hours a day or 10 hours, whatever it may be, and by that 9th, 10th hour, you grab the wrong dop stick and you apply it. And that's something that you're just going to have to clean it down and figure out how to get it back to the 60K polish. And sometimes, and I know that Brett Costner will be here tomorrow doing some other demos on if a scratch happens on your stone, and he'll demonstrate that as well. But before moving from the DOP, check your whole stone under a loop. Because if you don't do that and then you have a scratch at the end of it, it's going to be very hard to get it back onto the DOP and place it back onto your lap. Sometimes what happens if I get a scratch and I notice that the scratch happened after it's already off the DOP, there are small ways that you can use a micromotor to either take the scratch out or round a small chip, things of that nature. And that just comes with precision and being able to have the right tools for the job. I like to use hard felt wheels or bristle brushes for polishing stones after the fact, if needed. And sometimes I do a lot more fantasy cutting than I do traditional cutting as well. So bristle brush hand polishing, which are just like hard wheels that you use with your rotary tool. You coat those in a diamond grit, and you can get into fantasy cut grooves and polish things that way as well. So I have a lot more that I'm going to be doing on the demo and kind of demonstrating these things. So let me switch over to the Gem Cut Studio if we can, and I'm going to go over to the lab, and you guys can feel free to join. Come crowd around. All right, so let's wake up the computer. Perfect. All right, cool. I have everything on the Gem Cut Studio up here as well. And a lot of times when I'm cutting gemstones, I kind of go back and forth between what I'm cutting and the program, especially if something happens to where I misindex or I put in a facet that I didn't want to put in. I'll definitely be going back and forth with the program. So right here I have an amethyst that I've pre-cut at just a higher grit, so at like a 500 grit, 600 grit. And I have it all set up here to where I have, as you can see up on the screen, my pavilion angle is at 42.5, which is a little higher than the critical angle of the stone, so I can get some reflection back. If you're not sure what critical angle is for the stone, I can show you a quick example. So if I were to edit this tool and I change this down to, let's say, 35 degrees, it's going to create a window in the middle of this stone. And that window isn't necessarily what you want for a nice brilliant cut stone. You see how you can see the background here? And I can even have a different background color. You can see where the window is. Here we go. Separate window color. Let me see. Perfect. Yeah, you see the green color here? That's a window in the gemstone. That's something that when you look through it, you're just going to have a blank spot. Now, if you're doing fantasy cut stones, windows are good because you can carve into those windows and add design. But if you're doing a traditional cut stone, windows aren't always going to be the best. And I'm sure you see a lot of stones with windows that have great color, but depending on how flat that stone is, you may not get the best result as far as brilliance back to your eye and the reflection of the facets. So if I go back, right, just undo, Control Z. Great. So as you can see with this comparison, this is a lot different to where you're not going to have that big window in the middle of the stone. You can change your angle slightly to get rid of some of the black here, depending on the piece. But this is what I have currently on the DOP. So say something happens where I'm cutting, right? Right now I'm at 42.5 degrees, and my index is at 18, which is one of the facets that I'm going to be working on my 90 degree. But say that let's say here. So the 42.5 is highlighted, and you see all the indexes that I'm going to be using, the 96 through the 88, right? Say one of those numbers I put in incorrectly. So what's the number between 0 and 96? Let's say 13, right? I'm going to change my index wheel to 13, and I'm going to put in a facet that I didn't want to put in, okay? So let me raise this up. Maybe let me change the angle a little bit on this too. Let's say I change this to like a 53, which is none of the numbers on that pavilion. And again, maybe this just happens. Maybe you're changing your angles, you're adjusting things, and you don't quite think it through before you start cutting again. Let me start running this one. Water, there we go. So if I go down here, and right now I'm set at 13 on my index, and I'm at 53 on my angle, which again isn't any of the pavilion angles that I have. And let's say I just go down and I touch the stone, and I cut in a facet that I didn't quite want to be there. And I wasn't really prepared for it. Maybe again I wasn't paying attention in some way, which we all do a little bit. And I just put in a facet that I don't quite like or didn't really want, right? And I'm like, I pick it up and I look at it and I go, oh no, what happened, right? So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna see a couple things. Depending on what stage I am in my cutting process, I could either choose to ignore the fact that I put in the wrong facet and just cut everything again from start to finish. That could be a pain sometimes though, depending on where you are in the process. Maybe you're trying to finish up a stone for a deadline. With that being said, maybe there's a way that I can incorporate this facet. Earlier I mentioned if you mess up symmetrically, and that's something that I like to incorporate sometimes too, and that could add to your design in different ways that you weren't quite expecting. So what I did, again, 53 angle and a 13 index, I'm going to add this into my GemCut Studio program, and I'm going to see what changes happen. So if I go and I change my angle, is anybody here familiar with GemCut Studio? Raise your hands if you are. Okay, great. Well, this is helpful because this is a whole cool program that you can use for designing your gemstones. As you can see, I'll just kind of go over this a little bit just so you can see as well. But on the top here, where you see the 96, this is my index wheel. I can rotate it back and forth and change what numbers I have for my index. And the index is where I rotate the stone, right? And then over here with the 45, this is where my angle is. So I can change the angle anywhere from that 90 degrees all the way down to 0 degrees, and that is going to give me the different angles that I'm using to cut the gemstone that we have on the dot. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put in that 53 degree. I'm going to type that in here, 53 degrees. And then I had this cut in at 13 accidentally. So let me bring in my depth and show you where this cut kind of happens. So this is where we are. And this is where it's coming in, where that flat plane is. Oh, no, let me I have to change my symmetry to 0. I'm putting in just this one flat plane, like that, right? That doesn't look too bad, but now it's uneven. We don't have all the same facets going all the way around. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add this facet 4 more times around the stone. And the way that I do that is that I have my stone set up at the 13 degree, right? I'm actually going to change this back to my 0, which is 96. And I'm going to put in a symmetry of 2 and a mirror of 13. And you see how it added these 4 facets into the stone? And something like that, I could incorporate those now into the design rather than having to cut out the facet that was a misindex and change the weight, the dimension, the size of the stone that I'm already cutting. Because as you can see here, if there's no camera on it, but you can see this stone already has all the girdles cut in as well as the other facets. And maybe this is for a project where you have a specific length and width for your stone, and you don't want to change that too much because you already have a setting for it or something like that, right? You know, if you're cutting an 8x10, oh, cool, that's awesome. So, all right, where's the facet that I put in? Right here. Where is it? Right there. See that little facet right there? So that's the one that was the misindex. And now I don't have that on any of the other sides, and I have to incorporate that. Now I want to be able to incorporate that evenly. If you're not sure about faceting and how these things work, usually when you cut in your first facet and then you're doing additional symmetrical facets, those symmetrical facets are all going to be at the same original depth. So what I can do is I'm going to change this back to 13, and I'm at the 58 degree, or 53 degree rather. See? Happens. So I put this down. I cut that in a little bit, right? I don't know if we can switch back from this to the GemCut Studio a lot, because that's going to be kind of part of it as well.
Yep, whenever you're ready.
Oh, cool, thank you. So I cut in that 53 at 13, and now because I have my depth, that I just cut in, and you can kind of hear it a lot of the times too. As much as we're going with sight for a sight and feel for the cutting, sound is such a big one for me because you can hear when something isn't quite hitting the lap, right? So if you listen, that's obviously cutting more, and that's kind of cutting a lot less. And this is where I kind of want my depth. I want all the sounds to be symmetrical as well. And that's how I judge a lot of my depth process in the early stages of cutting is if I put my stone down, and that's actually how I notice if I misindex or have an incorrect angle as well, because there's times where the cutting will be smooth and you put it down and it sounds smooth, and then sometimes if I misindex and I just slam it down, you're going to hear a larger grinding sound, right? And that sound is an indication to me that, oh, I might have messed up, you know? So if I had it at the 13 degree, or the 13 index at 53 degrees, I'm just going to go to the next one in this series. So it says 13, 35, 61, 83. That's what I'm going to do to create those next 4 series of facets that were essentially misindexed. So if I change from the 13, I'm going to rotate my index dial to 35. And then I'm going to, and you'll hear the sound, a lot louder, right? And I'm just going to kind of hit the sound. I look at it, see how much I cut in. We can probably switch back to this maybe. You're good, thank you. All right, so I have this facet here was the first one. And then I have this one now that I'm cutting in right here next to my index finger. One's a little bigger right now, this one's a little larger, this one's a little smaller, so maybe I'll cut that one just a hair more. And you can see how as I'm looking at the stone, I'm lifting the index wheel and I'm turning it around. This is part of the reason why sometimes you may make mistakes, because as you look and turn it around and then you put it back and then you just start working on it, you may have put it at the wrong index part, you know? And sometimes the index wheels, depending if you have a new or an older machine, some of the older machines, the index wheels are very faded. So it's very easy to mistake going from an 8 to a 9 on the index. So if I go to, it was 35, and I just cut that a little more, and I try to make a facet that's approximately even to the one that I previously did. And because I'm still in my, I'm not at pre-polish or anything like that, I'm just kind of cutting things in. Things can be as close as you can get it. And then during the pre-polish stage is where I really try to make all my meet points meet exactly. So after I do 35, I'm going to go to 61. And again, the same thing, you'll hear the difference in sound. And not only am I judging sound, but I don't know if you can get a thing on the index here, or on the angles. So as I cut, this is now exactly at 53 once I get to the facet that I want. But let me change this to the next one, which is 83. And you can see when I hit down, it'll probably be a little higher than 53. It'll probably be 53.06. So I change this down. See how it's at a little higher? And I'm just going to cut this down to where it says 53. Take a look at it. Probably do a little more. And that's usually how you're judging your different facets and how deep you're cutting. It's really based on the first initial facet in that series in your design pattern. You know, once I cut the first one, I then have to, and the first cut, I'm, you know, changing my depth very slightly, making sure I'm getting the meat and the facet that I want. And then once I have the first one, I then do the next series of 12 or 10 or whatever it may be, right? So that's what I usually do depending on where I am in my faceting pattern. If I misindex or I change something, that's usually where it is and where I try to fix it. I like the messing up symmetrically idea because there's so many times where you want to maintain, especially expensive stones. You know, amethyst, quartz, things like that are pretty inexpensive. You can definitely play around with those. But say you're cutting a sapphire or a tanzanite, you're trying to maintain weight, but also, you know, cutting into brilliance and making sure that your stone looks really nice. That's going to be where if you mess up, it's going to be a harder hit to the wallet as well as the time that you spent in cutting. So with that being said, if I misindex, I try to find my way around it rather than cutting through it, if that makes sense. So that's kind of where I do a couple of these things and just change up the next series. So after misindexing, if I misalign something, those are kind of the two things. Now if I come into a fracture, that's a little harder. Fractures you usually want to cut out if they surface. If you have a stone that you're cutting and you don't realize there's quite a fracture in it until you hit that part, that's something where you can't quite work around and you more have to work through it. Because if I hit a fracture in this amethyst, luckily this one doesn't seem to have any, but if I were to hit a fracture in this amethyst and it starts to surface and maybe chip out, that's where I'm going to have to cut through and likely have a different design for the stone. With that being said though, one thing that you can do, instead of just having to keep cutting down and down and down, if we can switch back to the GemCut Studio, one thing that you can do in this program, which is really neat, is you can change all of your angles without changing any of your facets. So if I go to the tools here, and I go to, actually it's over in Edit. If I go to Edit, and I go to Scale Z, I'm able to change my pavilion very slightly. And you can see how it changes the stone pretty significantly depending on how you change it. You see the render of the stone down here, and you can change how, if I have this really high, it windows my whole stone out, and it changes all of my angles on the left side to different angles. But it doesn't change any of my indexes. Those different angles can be a benefit if you were to have a fracture in your stone. So say if I wanted to cut out a fracture, whether on the pavilion or the crown, I would just adjust my facets down slightly and then recut the stone and see if that fracture cuts out. And you can apply that, and then you can recut your pavilion in that way. This is something that I use a lot of the time, and especially if you're just trying to figure out a cool design for your stone, and maybe you're not quite set on different angles and indexes for your piece yet, but you're just trying to make a design. Changing your optimization essentially for your pavilion and your crown is going to really create the best piece for your gemstone. And it also gives you a cool visual of what these things look like if I change very slightly. So, say I adjusted all my angles down, you have to then recut all of your facets, which some people may not want to do, depending on the work that you're doing, but it may be better for you to do that to get the best result. And that's something that I usually come along if I hit a fracture or something chips out of my stone. Or again, if I say I'm like faceting a stone and I don't know if I can quite demo me messing up so badly right here, but let me see if I can do this real quick for you. So if I go this back to 42.5, which is where I was at previously. So if I'm at 42.5, I'm cutting in, I want to make sure I'm at my right index, which is at 32 here. You can't really see here. At 32 on my index, I'm cutting in. Say I'm cutting in here, right? And then say I go off the edge and I like put in a chip or something that I don't quite want. You can't quite see it, but there's a little scratch that I just put on the stone on purpose. You can't really see it, but there's a little scratch here, right here. So if something like that happens, or I've had it happen to where I've gone off the lap and my Q-lit chips, I just will recut down back to the point of Q-lit or adjust my angles accordingly. Those are a couple things that happen with, what other mistakes have you guys had while you're fasting? Any? I'm not sure if any of you have the experience of that, but are there any mistakes that you guys have run into while you're fasting? No? All right.
That was a big one for me, running off the plate,
Yeah.
on the table or something like that right when you're just finishing up, especially when you're polishing.
Yeah, polishing's the big one too, especially if you're polishing and you get a small scratch in your stone. That's definitely a little harder to get out because you're already at the polishing stage, right? So that say you're at 60K and you're trying to get that little scratch out, you can spend as much time as you can on that, and you might be able to get it out depending on your lab. But depending on how deep it is, you'll probably have to go back to a pre-polish stage like 3K and get that facet out, maybe redo a couple, and then go back to your polish stage. One thing that happens to a lot of people too is your stone may pop off the dop, which is not very fun to handle. So let's see if I can get this to pop off the dop. I'm probably not going to do it. I don't want to ruin any of these laps by putting too much force and pressure on it. I want to see if I can just kind of break this one off and then see if I can fix it for you guys. So if I take this out here, and then I'll also show you guys how to realign it back into your mast. So I don't know if I'll be able to break this. I wish we had pliers.
Leatherman?
Huh?
Leatherman?
Do you have a Leatherman? Let's see. All right, well, apparently I did this one really well. Let's see if I think I have another stone here, actually, that I can probably pop off the dot for you guys. Oh, perfect. Thank you so much. So I obviously don't recommend quite doing this, but all right. So sometimes your stone may pop off the dot. Yeah, just break it. So sometimes your stone will pop off the dot, but what happens when your stone pops is you can kind of see that it'll puzzle piece a little bit back together, right? Between the wax and the glue that you have in your stone, because I like to use both. Some people are wax purists, they'll only use wax. Some people like to use only glue because wax will always pop off the dot for them. But I like to use both just for surface area, and it gives me a better hold over time. As you can see, I couldn't really break it off the dot, which was nice. So what I'll usually do in this scenario is I try to figure out how these things puzzle piece back together. And whether it's one way or the other, let's see, that kind of fits back into here like this, right? And very simply, I'll take some glue. I like to use Loctite a lot of the time, but some people are very about the UV reactive glues. I usually use Loctite with an accelerator because I'm impatient and I like to cut things pretty fast. So if you have some type of UV glue, what I'll do is I'll add the glue back to the dot. Oh, I think this one's stuck. Can I cut that? Yeah, well, this one's the super hold UV. Does the glue work? Oh, no. Yeah, maybe I'll just have to use the Leatherman to cut it out, but I also don't want to ruin his glue thing. None of these are my tools. These are other people's tools. So, all right. All right, well, we'll pretend at this point. So usually what I'll do is I'll have some glue, and then I'll essentially puzzle piece this back together. Once I puzzle piece this back together, just to try to make sure that I still have the same angles and indexes that I did previously, I'll put this back into my mast, and I'll have to realign it with the stone in place. That realignment, you'll have to see what your width-length ratio is for the stone, and make sure, because if you cut everything in to the right depth all the way around, you'll at least be able to see the differences in depth once you had to re-dop it, essentially. I'm wondering if this glue, if I can get this up, but that's fine. So I do have another stone here, which I'll just show, and I'll do that because I can't quite glue this one now. Brought a couple backups. All right. So what I'll do here is if I pop the stone off the dop, I had to realign it back onto my mast, or onto my dop, right? I'll put it back into the mast, and then whatever angle and index I started with, I have to realign it back to that point. So I'm going to change my angle back to 90 degrees. Back up my mast. And for the V5s, you'll have to put your water guard down so that your mast and dop won't interact with it. I bring this back down to the mast to try to realign everything. And I know that I usually have a facet at 96, which is my 0. So I'm going to bring this down and try to make sure everything's flat to the mast. And you see how it's flat. You can definitely tell if it's like a tilted up angle or anything like that, depending on what it is. It's hard to see from that angle, but I try to make sure everything's flat. Then once it is, I just tighten it back into the dot, tighten it back into the mast. Then I bring my stone up, and then I try to recut the same facets in the same way. Sometimes you'll have to recut the facets just because it may be off a tinge of degree, up or down. So that's one of the scenarios where you'll likely have to recut a little bit. I do wish this glue worked. So those are a couple different things that I'll kind of run into as I'm cutting. The other things that I kind of mentioned too was after, say your stone pops off the top and you have to recut this. The bigger ones that I kind of deal with, like you mentioned, was polishing during a scratch, like getting a scratch during a polishing stage. That definitely can be difficult. And usually you just have to kind of, what was that?
Just hand me the glue, I'll see if I can.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. Usually what will happen if I am polishing and I get a scratch on the polish stage, I just have to kind of go back through my pre-polish. I like using hand tools sometimes if I need to kind of get something out that I didn't quite expect to be there. But the hand tools, unfortunately, can leave divots sometimes. So you never want to leave like a hand tool polishing your rock too long. So you can kind of get little things out that way, but you can't get big things out. Big things I would just continue cutting on the lap. That's honestly really just a couple of the other mistakes. I wanted to have some questions for you guys if you have any mistakes that you've run through that I maybe didn't think of. But if you're not sure of any mistakes that you've run through, I'm just happy to answer any questions that you guys may have. If not, I'll just keep cutting.
I have a question.
Yeah.
This is the first time I've seen this working.
Oh, in general, okay.
First time. So when you started with the,
Pavilion.
yes.
Yes.
So how you switch to the
Crown.
that aligns with the,
Yeah, good question. Good question. So I believe here we have what's called a transfer jig. So this transfer jig is what will help you go from pavilion to crown. So after I cut my whole pavilion in, usually what I'll do is, so I'm finished with my pavilion, let's say, and this one's all done. I have to put it in my transfer jig, like this. And you see how it kind of has a slot where the dop goes into? I'll take another dop, right, that matches with the pavilion that I'm trying to adhere. And there's another hole up on this side, so I have to change this one. There's another hole up here that I'll put the dop into. This one's different than the one that I'm usually used to be honest. I think these ones actually work on the side. Yeah, it's a brick. I think that's
Solid.
yeah, solid glue. Oh, let's take this one out of here. Okay, so as you see here, this is like the transfer jig, right? So you'll heat wax up on this side, and you can either do that with an alcohol lamp. I actually like to use a torch for mine because, again, I like to do things quick. Alcohol lamps, you have to sit and hold it this way. And I have the full jewelry set up at my house, so having like a torch is pretty helpful. So I'll torch and I'll add wax. And doing that, you have a bunch of pooled wax here, and then you have to flip your transfer jig and lead this down to your, how's this one move? Does it just move that way? Great. So if I had a bunch of wax here, I'd heat it till it starts to pool. Then I would press it into the pavilion of the stone. And pressing it into the pavilion of the stone, you're then creating like a form. And sometimes I'll heat the stone very lightly as I do the wax because that will create a better seal for the dop, essentially. But sometimes I like to use the glue because say I do all that correctly and then this wax just pulls right off. I'll add the glue as an in-between layer, press down again, and then that's why you have like the UV reactive to speed up the process of the glue drying. But I also use like an accelerant sometimes, which is like either a spray or a liquid that you can use for it. But once you have that and everything's dopped together again on the other side, you heat the previous dop that it was holding your crown, and that just pops right off. So now you have it set for your crown. Yep, and then you would put it back into your mast and realign it at the indices that you have in your design. What usually it's at like a 96 or an 8 or whatever it may be. You just have to put this back to 90 degrees and lead it down to your lap.
So normally cutters normally go with those preset numbers, or
No,
these are
no.
their own?
They usually are all on their own. It just depends on what level you are in your cutting ability. There's a lot of people that will have all these, because there's so many designs that you can find online, right? And these are very pretty designs that you may want to cut into a stone. And those ones are very helpful, but I like to design my stones based on the rough. I think Nadine mentioned a little bit yesterday about how you want to maximize the rough that you have for the stone that you're cutting, and the best way to do that is just by designing your own stones. Because sometimes, like as you're all aware, like a tourmaline could be more of a rectangle shape or an emerald, right? Where something like a sunstone is pretty amorphous, and that will lead to a more abstract stone for me if I'm trying to maintain weight, Usually they say like an average cutting yield for stones can be anywhere between like 15 to 25%, but you can get, and that's for more maybe included stones, but you can get 30, 40, even 50% weight retention of the rough to the finished product if you're maximizing for weight with the shape that you choose. But yeah, usually what you're doing for Gem Cut Studio, and depending on the design, that's also going to depend on the stone, because stones have different critical angles. That critical angle, who's familiar with the term critical angle? So a critical angle for your gemstone is essentially where the stone will start to window if you cut past that point. So if I have a stone with a critical angle of 40, let's say, right? If I cut that stone with a pavilion of 37, 35, I'm going to have a window in the middle of that stone. But if I cut that stone to, let's say, a 42 or 43, it's going to be more reflective over time. Can you go back to the Gem Cut Studio, please? And what's cool, again, about the Gem Cut Studio program, which I really like this as a forefront for being able to design your own stones, is that Gem Cut Studio program gives you critical angles of different stones just based on the stone that you choose. So if I go into the rendering portion here, I go up, I'm currently in amethyst, right? But now it has all these different options of tourmaline, and you can change the colors. It has spinel, it has tanzanite, and all these different things have different refractive indices, and that will change the critical angle based on their refractive index. So that is also how you can adjust your stone. Like sapphires and garnets, those have a lower critical angle, so you can actually have slightly shallower pavilions that will still maximize your brilliance to the rough. So yeah, if cutting a certain design in quartz, I'm probably going to choose slightly different angles for cutting that same exact design in something like a sapphire. Any other questions? How many here have cut stones before? And this is not a lot of people have cut stones before. Okay, so a couple other things as far as what we're working with in gem cutting. There's so many different types of machines that you can use. Ultratechs are definitely some of the better Cadillac machines that you have out there. But there's Facets, there's also Gem Masters, and I think Raytex are also a pretty affordable machine that's like a handpiece machine. But each one of these comes with their own pros and cons. So there's so many different variability in the style of cutting. One thing that I also do a lot of is I do a lot of fantasy cutting work. Who here likes fantasy cut gemstones? Cool. So fantasy cut stones are much different in cutting than traditional cut stones. Because if I'm cutting something traditional, I'm trying to maximize the brilliance of the stone, the color, try to get a lot of reflection, right? But for fantasy cut stones, it's kind of the opposite. I'm actually cutting big windows into my stone so you can see whatever design pattern I'm cutting into it, right? And with those big windows, you're going to have different pavilion angles to reflect the carving. I can design something in here for you real quick to show you kind of what I mean. So if I do let's do a new piece. Let's save, yeah, no. So hold on. New. All right, so we start with this big square, right? And let's say I'm gonna just do a rectangular fantasy cut stone. So in order for me to design it from here, I'm gonna go start with my 90 degrees, which is my girdle, right? And we're going to do a big rectangle, let's say. So I'm going to change my symmetry to 2 because rectangles are bilaterally symmetrical. So I change this to 2. And I'm already at my 96 on my index wheel. And I just cut this in, and I bring in, by cutting in, I'm just bringing in my depth, and I'm changing the shape of the gemstone, right? So let's say that looks good, and I'm going to cut it. Now, what I want to do too, instead of maybe just a standard rectangle, I could do more of an emerald cut, so I can kind of bring in those corners, which is nice because if you're making stones for setting, sharp angles aren't always the best to set because they can chip as you're trying to hammer metal over them, right? So let me cut in those corner angles, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to have a symmetry of 4, and I'm going to change my index wheel to hit those angles. And it's actually that angle's at 12. One of the reasons why we have the 96 index wheel, in case you're not sure, is because 96 is divisible by so many different numbers, and that will allow you to cut symmetrical stones easier. So I can cut a 6-sided symmetrical stone, I can cut 8 sides, I can cut 12 sides, just because of the division of 96. A 3-sided triangular stone is easier with this index wheel. So let me cut in a little bit at the, I'm going to have a 12 index. I'm going to cut in those little side corners right there, right? Now, instead of me having, a 42-degree pavilion, which I can demonstrate here will give me a more brilliant stone. So if I change this, symmetry of 12, and I bring this in, you can see how this starts to change the bottom stone. You see how that's all green right now because of the big window in there? As soon as I cut in those facets, now you can see the brilliance of this quartz that I'm cutting into, right? But what I'm going to do for a fantasy cut stone, which is a little different, is I actually want steeper walls than the 42. The reason for that is due to reflection. So if I were to be cutting into a cube that is 90 degrees all the way around, and then I carve the bottom of that cube, that carving will actually reflect parallel to the carving in the walls and the side walls. So every deviation from 90 degrees, 89, 80, 70, 60, whatever it may be, that's going to bend your reflection that you're cutting. With that bend and reflection, there is a point of distinction to where you do not see the reflection anymore because it's too shallow. So for fantasy cut stones, I actually tend to go to 60 degrees, which is pretty steep. And I'm going to just change this a little bit to only cut in those side walls, like that. And I'll also end up having a flat bottom to this as well. So I end up just cutting pretty steep so I can try to give the form of my stone. So I do the one cut. I'm going to change this index to 24 and cut in the other side wall here. Cut. And I'm going to change my symmetry to 4 to cut in those side angles a little bit like that. And then what I'll do is I'll change my pavilion to 0 to cut in this flat spot in the bottom. Now because of GemCut Studio, you can't quite do fantasy cut designs in the program. Those are definitely things that you'll be doing afterwards as you learn more about them. But one thing I have done before, which should give me an idea of how these things reflect, is I actually just have a small like 5-degree facets in the bottom just to give me an idea of what things look like. So if I change this, you can kind of see how I'm cutting in these 5 facets. Like say you're going to do like a star pattern, like one of John Dyer's star patterns or something like that. You can have the facets kind of mimic it in the program just to see what your reflection looks like. And the one thing I do a little differently with this is you can frost facets in this program. If you like frosted facets in your gemstones, those can add cool designs as well. So if I want to distinctly frost a couple of these facets, I just have to click each one, hit frost facet, and it'll change a little bit. Like that. And now you can see in the gem design that I made, let me get out this window color, you can kind of see how that frosted facets reflect in the sidewalls of the design that you chose. You see I can't point with my fingers, but you see right here, that facet, that's actually a reflection now of this center design. So if I was going to do, let's say, like a mandala style or an intaglio carving, or really any scene or something like that, it will now start to reflect in those sidewalls, which is pretty fun. And with that reflection, it'll change. So if I were to change this angle now to, let's say, 45 degrees, you see how it's all black now and it doesn't have the same distinction and it doesn't have that same level of reflection. That's part of the reason why that you want to have a much steeper angle. But if I do something like 55, you still get that carving and you still get that reflection. A big thing with that as well, which you'll see in people like Dalen's work, is you have a very big a very big table, which is the very top of your stone. And that table is going to be much larger than the flat spot on the pavilion. And that's so you can actually, when you just look and peer down through the stone, you can see the reflection in those sidewalls much easier. Because as I start to build the top, let's say, that's going to change the distinction of those carving sides. You see how the design changed a little bit now that I don't have a table, and I kind of split the design in 2 different ways. That's pretty cool. And there's a lot of different ways that you can just play with the different angles of your facet to then get different reflection that you weren't quite expecting. There's a lot of times too where I'll finish a stone and it'll surprise me with the outcome. So if I just bring in this table, you can have a very large table, and it'll start to show the same reflection that we were seeing before. But again, if you just have a big split top, it actually doubles the design, which is pretty cool. All right. And I am going to be wrapping up soon because it's almost 1 o'clock, but do I have any other questions while you guys are here? No? Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And I hope you guys learned something, even if it's what not to do.